In a surprising move, the Phoenix Suns have hired Frank Vogel to be their next head coach. You heard me right. We haven't talked about him. On today's episode of Locked On Suns, a bonus episode, we will. Let's break it down. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen to close out your week. A bonus episode breaking down the big first domino of the Phoenix Suns offseason, hiring Frank Vogel as head coach. Hit follow or subscribe if you're finding us for the first time, or if you just haven't done so before. What are you waiting for? Become an everydayer. Get locked onto your favorite team each and every day. And bonus shows like this whenever there is breaking news. We're free and available on all podcast platforms. So wherever you are listening or watching, including YouTube, if you hit subscribe, you'll get a show every day just like that. Frank Vogel. I didn't even believe he was a real finalist. Egg on my head. I'm the idiot. Major L. Whatever you want to say. I got it wrong. But I wasn't the only one. Look, you guys know I'm far from any sort of insider about this team. I cover this team. I'm in person day to day, but this is a tight-lipped organization. This is something where only a select few people ever really break the news. And the people who do were telling us that Kevin Young was the likely guy. Bill Simmons was adamant about it on his podcast. John Gambadoro seemed to think it was headed that direction. Mark Stein had been reporting for a long while that Devin Booker was pushing pretty hard for the Kevin Young side of this. Shortly before Vogel gets named, we saw Doc Rivers removing his name from consideration. Take that for whatever you will. Obviously, Nick Nurse, who is allegedly one of the 5 finalists. We still don't fully know what the back and forth on that was like, but he's now the coach in Philadelphia, so it doesn't really matter. And now we are left with Vogel being hired in Phoenix. This is instantaneous thoughts, and so I'm not gonna do too much of the X's and O's. I want to hopefully get some guests on throughout the coming week about Vogel's story. I mean, this is a guy this is his 4th head coaching opportunity. He's been a coach from as long as when, 2 bigs were dominating games and Paul George was a 2 guard. Now Paul George is a 4 sometimes, and, nobody plays 2 interior big men like that. So, well, not many teams, right? So he's had a long evolution. I'm not going to try to dip into exactly how this team will look. I think a lot of it will have to do with the roster. I think the fact that it's not young makes it even more up in the air as to how they go about building this roster, because despite the fact that Kevin Young would have had a lot of different perspectives and thoughts, I think the fact that if it had been him, that you're keeping someone who had familiarity would have made it a little bit more easy to follow. Okay, well then they will keep this, and this, and they need to upgrade here, and then that'll be the team. With Vogel, it's a little different, and we don't exactly know what his philosophies and viewpoints will be. That said, I am not nearly as negative about this as I'm already seeing fans online be. However, it's going to be interesting for 2 specific things. Frank Vogel is a defensive tactician. Frank Vogel is known for his defense. Frank Vogel is known for, especially I would say, the way that he's been able to use specific big men in the postseason and just to really, quite frankly, revolutionize defense. First with Roy Hibbert, who you will remember, the verticality, the drop defense, all that stuff, just anchoring Hibbert at the rim, helping at the basket, and really just taking that to new heights. Then I would say with the Lakers, Anthony Davis. A lot of even what you see Davis doing in this postseason, where he, is guarding Andrew Wiggins as a helper against the Warriors, or, being the help guy against Nikola Jokic at times, like all the breakdown X's and O's schematic things that Anthony Davis did and got a lot of attention for this go round, that started in 2020 in the bubble when the Lakers won the title. If you remember, Davis was doing everything from executing, a hedge against Damian Lillard, picking or pull up threes in that first round series. Then he's executing a trapping scheme and guarding Russell Westbrook at times against the Rockets in the second round. Third round, he's switching the Jokic-Murray pick and roll, which was not nearly as devastating back then as it is now, but even obviously was still something to behold. And Davis was able to switch and do both of those things. So again, without getting too much down that rabbit hole, that is what Vogel is known for. And so what I will be interested to see is that, can he do enough offensively? Does he have the pieces defensively to execute what it is that he wants to do? Can he bring something special to take this Suns defense to another level? Obviously, an immediate question that comes to mind there is, well, what does that mean for DeAndre Ayton? And we'll get into that as the weeks and months go along, but that's one. The other one is, I would say, personality-wise, and I guess what I would say is maybe not personality, but superstar players, right? Because I think in Indiana, he had a pretty upstart team. Like a lot of those guys, Danny Granger had been a star, but, he's Danny Granger, not the top of the top by any means. Paul George became a superstar, then eventually left, but he really was there at the very beginning of his career. Orlando, which is the other stop in between Indiana and LA, I wouldn't say Vogel really got a fair shake. The GM that hired him was fired after the first season. There was pressure to maybe win, but the roster wasn't really there to win. The roster just didn't have a lot of talent overall, and they didn't, they're still trying to get out from underneath the post-Dwight era in Orlando, so I don't really hold too much there. But then the Lakers, you would say he seemed to have a pretty solid relationship and got a lot out of LeBron James and Anthony Davis in the first couple of years. Then they trade for Russell Westbrook, which was an ill-fated move from the very second that it happened. And you could tell his relationship with Russ wasn't good. The philosophies he wanted to instill, offensively and defensively, I would say, weren't ever really able to be put together, not just because of Russ, but that way that roster thinned out and was filled with a bunch of, mediocre to bad defenders, older players, all that in that final season. It just wasn't going to work. But that leaves us with an interesting track record, especially when you factor in that, and we'll talk about this later, Kevin Young seemed to at least be Devin Booker's pick from all what the reporting says. I'm not saying I sat here and interviewed Devin Booker before I hopped on the podcast, but that was everything that you've heard indicated that, including Bill Simmons today, including John Gambadoro today, including obviously Mark Stein, who I mentioned in the past, all these people who were indicating, yeah, Book wants Kevin Young. And so with that not happening, and the fact that we don't know Frank Vogel to necessarily be the best of the best of the best in terms of connecting with superstar players. I think you think of Ty Lue, right? Maybe even Eric Spoelstra, Steve Kerr to some degree, although maybe that's arguable when it comes to Durant and maybe Draymond and others. But, I don't think Vogel's that guy either. Not a lot of coaches are. I mean, that's kind of the era we're in. It's not an easy job to make star players comfortable and happy while also winning. It's a balancing act. But those are the two questions that I have is, what about that Lakers situation was real from that standpoint with how it all ended and frankly, what seemed like pretty bad terms that Vogel left LA on? How much of that was real or Vogel's fault versus just circumstances, or Russ's fault or LeBron's fault or Pelinka's fault? And then defensively, does he have the pieces to actually be a special defensive coach here, or does he need more? And what does that look like? And of course, if he's a defensive tactician, was that really what the Suns needed? And so I want to get into that next. We'll do the pros and the cons, a little bit more X's and O's, but still not a full deep dive. But I have some thoughts here on the flexibility, the versatility, the stubbornness, the creativity, all the things that I think you want a coach to be that at times Monty Williams was not. Can Frank Vogel be that on both sides of the floor? First, today's show brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network and an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA Finals because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel has odds up for the Game 2 of the NBA Finals already. The Nuggets are 8.5-point favorites at home. They are minus 370 on the money line. The over-under is a low 214.5. I think at one point Miami, even if they just make shots and Denver, isn't so out of sorts, especially Jokic as a scorer, I think you'll see a higher scoring game. Maybe there's a nice over there to be hit. The Nuggets tend to hit the over a few times during their series. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook, so visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Pros and cons of Frank Vogel, new Suns head coach. So let's start with the defense, and I'll do pros and cons of defense, pros and cons of offense. Let me start with the pros on defense. One is, I think that we have this idea, and even if you read a little bit of what there was with Vogel, like I read an article coming off on silverscreenandroll.com, which is the SB Nation blog of the Lakers. They do a really good job. Darius Soriano wrote an article there, and I really like his work, and he basically said that there was just a sort of stubbornness defensively when it came to Vogel in that final season where guys like Trevor Ariza and Carmelo Anthony, DeAndre Jordan, were being asked to execute defensively in a way that they just couldn't, right? And so that could lead you to believe that there's a little bit of stubbornness there and inflexibility, lack of creativity, and just sort of we're doing things my way, and that's that. And obviously coming off of Indiana, I think there was a little bit of that too, right? But I think that was the roster. I mean, what are you really going to do? How are you going to pivot when Hibbert goes from being a huge part of your team to somebody who really can't play in the league? That's not easy. But I just keep coming back to Anthony Davis. And I think of this actually as a pro. I think of Vogel's defensive scheming as a pro, not a con. Not that he's too stubborn and set in his ways, but I think what he showed us with the way that he was able to use Anthony Davis was super creative, super modern, super even series to series. He was able to demonstrate that he can reimagine what the scheming is going to need to be. Right? For a lot of this way, in a lot of the ways that I talked about in that last segment. And so I think of that as a pro. Now, I guess a con would be that maybe the roster is not what you need him to be, what you need it to be for him to maximize it, right? Can he be creative defensively with what this roster is right now? Maybe. But I think one of the things about those Lakers teams that was the best example we can really take of what a modern defensive structure that Vogel put together was, what it looked like, is that Vogel, they played with size, right? And so even if they didn't have, Hibbert and David West out there as their bigs, it's like, well, they still had, Markieff Morris actually played a bigger role than you maybe remember in those series, Kyle Kuzma, LeBron, obviously, and then even some of their guards and wings were pretty big, or at least played big, in KCP, Danny Green, Caruso. Like, those aren't, 6'6" guards, but in, they're long, they're at least, 6'4", 6'5", and they play big because they're strong and physical players. And when you have a lineup that is, let's say, Caruso, KCP, Kuzma, LeBron, Davis, I mean, that's still a pretty ideal defensive lineup. Can the Suns build lineups like that? I mean, right now, they did their best against the Clippers at times, right? They did their best against the Nuggets. I mean, a lineup of Booker at point guard with, we don't know who all the roster will have on it come next season. But, you say Josh Okogie, let's just say like Landry Shamet. I know that's not he's not going to be on the team next year, but let's just say that he's out there. And then Durant and Ayton, that even just last year, before they had this entire offseason to try to give Vogel a better lineup, that already is pretty close to something that, can work in the modern NBA and that Vogel could probably do some good stuff with if he has them more on a string, has Durant being used more creatively, has Ayton maybe executing a greater variety of coverages and not just having him in drop, which I would like to see. I mean, no matter who the big is, I think that if he's just in drop, then that's kind of exactly what Monty did most of the time. So I'd like to see that. But I guess the con here, to get to my point, is that they probably need a little bit of a different type of roster with Vogel. And so it's not exactly a hand-in-glove fit, right? I think there was a version of the roster where you could have rolled it much more over to offense, maybe played a little bit smaller, maybe de-emphasized the big man position, maybe had more shooting versus, defense and size. So now with Vogel, I guess the difference is you probably have to get a little bit more creative and maybe pivot a little bit with what the roster is going to look like. That can be a con or that can be a pro. I don't know. I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about which types of players are easier to get, but that's just my first instinct. Offense. The pros to start. He has gotten a championship level offense out of letting superstars do what they're great at. And as much as I personally would have leaned offense, right? I would have. Kevin Young, I think it's from all indications is an offensive innovator. And we'll get to this to close out the show, but there are rumors already that, that Young might stay. I don't know how that would go. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, it can get ugly. But there was more upside in a hire like that to innovate offensively. It's the same reason that even somebody like Nick Nurse didn't really excite me, and why from the jump I was like Ty Lue or an assistant, because I felt like somebody like Kevin Young, somebody like Jordi Fernandez, who engineered a lot of what the Sacramento Kings have done offensively and was on the Nuggets staff in the early part of Jokic's career. Those guys were going to be able to give you more of a creative offensive approach. Vogel probably isn't going to do that, but obviously, again, the pro being he has made it work with superstar players before, and I think Devin Booker is at a point in his career, as he showed in that Clippers series, where his own ability and his own IQ is going to get you a long way. And Durant has been at that level for a decade, So you probably don't need a lot. You probably need functional two-way players around them, guys who can put pressure on the rim, guys who can shoot, guys who can handle the ball, and Durant and Booker are going to be enough for you. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. The Suns role players didn't hit enough shots. They got hurt. They weren't able to play consistent defense, and that's why they lost. But the Suns were putting up offensive showings that could keep up with Denver. That was true. So even if you feel like Monty wasn't an imaginative offensive thinker when it came to Booker and Durant, maybe he didn't have enough time. Maybe he would have been, but they clearly didn't have a lot. You think about the end of Game 2 against the Nuggets as a great example. They just started chucking shots in isolation, and that's a big part of why they lost that game, even after Chris Paul went out, right? But they were still close, right? So it's like if you think that Vogel can put something like that together, assemble a staff of assistant coaches, we've at least seen it work. And there's something to be said for that. And I maybe Durant and Booker aren't at the level of LeBron and Anthony Davis, definitely not at the level of LeBron. I mean, that's just something else in terms of him just being able to go get a switch and attack it. There's nothing like that in the history of the league. But Durant and Booker are, of anybody you would want in the league, they're up there. Another pro on offense, actually, is that Vogel's teams have always pushed the pace. And again, you think back to the Lakers. Part of what their defensive swarming was able to do was give them transition opportunities. And I believe even heading into the Lakers situation, Vogel had been known for that. With the Magic they ran, I believe Elfrid Payton was around when Vogel was around, if I'm remembering the years correctly. And So obviously he was a big transition guy. And so that's always been something Vogel has tried to do. Turn defense into offense, encourage his teams to run, put the ball in the guys' hands who are going to be the most dangerous in transition. Obviously, when you have LeBron, that's a lot easier, but that was a trademark of those Lakers teams, and I think the Suns need that and can do that, can be that type of team. I mean, they really tried to embrace that against the Clippers and Lakers in these playoffs. It might have been a little too little too late, but if they can continue it, I think they'll feel really good. The con offensively, I just think is pretty obvious, and it's exactly what I've already mentioned multiple times. This is just not a guy who's thought of as an offensive innovator. That side of the ball is not where he's made his money. That side of the ball is not where it's just not what you're hiring him for. And again, I personally would have preferred to bring in somebody who at least would have unlocked somebody like, let's say, Josh Okogie, right? I think the Suns should bring him back. Darius Baisley. There are ways to use players like that as rollers, as, the way that we've seen guys like Jared Vanderbilt or Bruce Brown be used in the past to make them work. And maybe there's still a limit on that. Maybe that's not how you should be, hiring your head coach. But the best offenses, I think, have great players, but also have elements to the sets being drawn up that also make life easier for everybody. And I'm just always going to lean offense in the modern NBA, but maybe it is just a matter of your offense is going to be as good as your best players are, and there's only so much a coach can do, so go to defense. But I think that's an obvious con. All right, let's close out with who made the decision. And I know this is a little nerdy, a little hard to... It's just guessing at the end of the day, but I think it's important, and I think that the way that this search unrolled tells us a lot about what happened. So let's dive into that next. First, a quick break. Closing out the show, let's talk about who made this decision. So you can take or leave Bill Simmons' words here, because obviously he's the guy who told us it was going to be Kevin Young, and then it ended up not being Kevin Young. But I think that there's still some insight that we can glean from Simmons' latest tweet, where he admits to being wrong and says this: it was Kevin Young for a couple weeks. Then Ishbia decided he wanted someone splashier and more experienced and shifted gears. What's interesting is that Booker was pushing hard for KY, but Vogel is an excellent coach. Can't wait to find out what happened. It feels obvious that that's how this played out, to be honest. Because at a certain point this week, it started to be weird why the delay was happening, right? Because Nick Nurse gets hired. I don't think any of us really took Doc Rivers seriously all that much. I think he's just a worse coach than Monty Williams. And then, it's like, well, are they really going to hire Jordi Fernandez over Kevin Young when they sort of have their own version of Jordi Fernandez? So everybody was just assuming it was Kevin Young. Now, of course, we ignored that Frank Vogel had always been considered a finalist, although what I will point out is, if you remember my episode last Monday or Tuesday, whatever it was, I did an episode called, no one knows who the Suns' next head coach is going to be. And Vogel wasn't included. I can't remember who had it as 4 finalists and who had it as 5 finalists, but whoever had it as 4, the name that of the NBA insider guys who were throwing out tweets on all this, whoever had 4, the name that was excluded was Vogel. And so we obviously overlooked that. I obviously overlooked that. Yet when you, again, go back to the timing, it was either they were waiting for one last push on Ty Lue, which maybe is just, optimistic thinking. Maybe that was never realistic in the first place. But that was maybe, you could think it, maybe they're just trying for one last negotiation with the Clippers on Lue. Or they're getting cold feet, they're hesitating on Kevin Young, and they don't know what to do. It obviously ended up being the second thing, and, before I even saw Simmons' tweet, I texted in the Just Basketball Slack that we use to talk for that podcast. I was like, this is an Ishbia hire. And then, of course, Simmons tweets that, and other people have kind of backed it up since. And you can feel either way about it. I think if it had been Rivers, I think you would have had reason to be a lot more upset as a Suns fan that Ishbia took it over and hired somebody who, as I just said, I think demonstrably is just not as good of a coach even as Monty. Look no further than the fact that the Detroit Pistons gave Monty Williams tens of millions of dollars to be their next head coach, and no one has yet hired Doc Rivers, right? So that should prove that Rivers would have been a sidestep, if not a step back. Having Ishbia take over and make it Vogel is a little harder to parse because this is a guy who obviously has won a championship in the modern NBA. This is a guy who continues to get new opportunities, is well-respected, and I think at the end of the day, like, Doc Rivers got fired because he had 2 more playoff failures right after Brett Brown had a bunch of playoff failures. So the thing he was hired to do, which was to take the Philadelphia 76ers to the next level, just did not happen. Nick Nurse got fired because, yes, he won a title, but he was forced out because he just lost the locker room or, wasn't able to make the most of their talent, whatever way you want to look at it. It was a direct byproduct of his own failings, his own poor coaching job. Vogel just got, ran over in that situation. I'm not saying that if they don't trade for Westbrook, Vogel wins another championship or he takes them further than like Darvin Ham could have or whatever. But setting him up to fail with a thinned out roster and with Russell Westbrook and, an old team and everything else, it's no surprise that Frank Vogel that Darvin Ham and the Lakers this year with a younger team, a deeper team, a more versatile modern team go a lot further. The talent was always there. Vogel just got the short end of the stick as time went by, especially after they make that Westbrook trade. Even in 2021, if you remember, Vogel faced the Suns in that first round. The Lakers were favored, I believe, to beat the Suns as a 7 seed. And they were favored because the reason they were the 7 seed was because of injuries. I'm not going to relitigate that whole series, but obviously Suns fans will remember the Lakers went up 2-1 in that series, and Anthony Davis was dominating, and it felt like the Suns were going to lose in the first round. Then all of a sudden things flip. The Suns start playing a lot better. Chris Paul comes back. Campaign plays well. Obviously Booker goes off, and the rest is history. Davis isn't able to make an impact the rest of the way, and then from there Vogel really never had another shot. I say all of that to say that Vogel being the guy that Ishbia vouched for, you can at least make the case that he was ready and deserving of another opportunity. The reason he lost his last job wasn't necessarily his fault. And that he's a winning coach with a winning pedigree who deserves what he's getting. I'm not even arguing with who it came down to. Again, I just gave you pros and cons. I think it's a solid hire. It's not the one that I wanted, but it's fine. It's more just that Ishbia did this, period. We now have, and I'll take an L on this one too. I've been trying to tell you with the Durant trade and some other things that Ishbia was maybe not as involved as our worst inclinations would have allowed us to think. But I don't think that we can say that anymore. The Durant trade, it seems pretty clear if you continue to just hear how it's talked about among reporters and insiders around the league that do content. They continue to say that was a largely Ishbia move. The firing of Monty seemed to be largely an Ishbia move from everything you hear. And then now this. So the 3 biggest moves that the Suns have now made have been made by the owner. I think we all liked the Durant trade, although some of you seem to be a little panicky on that right now. I would urge you to remember that Kevin Durant is an amazing player. But that's a move that I think you like to have made, right? Monty, I think fans wanted that move. So again, okay. This is probably the first one that could go either way. Now, my closing thoughts. Sounds like Kevin Young might stay on the staff. John Gambadoro has also tweeted David Fizdale, who you'll remember as he was a Heat assistant. Then he was the Grizzlies head coach. He was the take that for data guy. And then he was with the Lakers as an assistant coach when Vogel was there. He's in the front office of, I think it's the Grizzlies now. And so he might come. The Jazz. He's an assistant GM for the Jazz, but Gambo thinks he might come. I don't know how tenable it would be for Kevin Young to stay on this staff. It would take a whole lot of humility for him to come back. I think it would be good if it could, in a perfect world, work, then great. Sure, make it happen. I think Fizdale, take it or leave it. I don't really know if he's, I just don't know. I'm not saying he wouldn't. I'm not going to say he would make a difference. I think that Vogel needs a staff that's going to work, that's going to help him offensively. He's built good staffs in the past. A lot of his former assistants have gone on to bigger and better. I also think that it's going to be important for the roster, as I said, to fit what he wants to do. Maybe be a little bigger. Maybe be a little bit more defensively inclined for Vogel to really be at his best. I think this can work. I don't think it's the end of the world. I'm excited to hear what Vogel says, especially about how he thinks the offense and defense can work here. And I'm excited for the process to be over. We can just move forward with at least one more thing locked into place. I'll have much more on X's and O's on Vogel's journey. I'll probably try to bring some Lakers, at least one Lakers guest on to talk about Vogel, maybe an X's and O's guys to help break some stuff down. More offseason to come. The rumors will probably start flying even more now that we have this domino that is now fallen for the Phoenix Suns. Hit follow or subscribe to get all of that broken down in your feed every single day. Become an everydayer. Get locked onto your favorite team. And I'll catch you guys next week.